In the last two sections, we talked about scalability and interoperability, respectively. But the third pillar of a third-generation blockchain, and what Cardano aspires to be, and probably one of the most important of the three pillars, is this idea of sustainability. And you could break sustainability into two components. First, there's the idea of how do we pay for things. So cryptocurrencies are not companies. Even if one is to say a cryptocurrency or a token is a security, it's still somewhat decentralized. It's still infrastructure. It's much more like roads. It's much more like TCP/IP. They're protocols. And so when you talk about a protocol that's open source, the idea is to minimize the operational cost of that protocol. So things like putting tolls on the protocol or intellectual property on the protocol, even if it's well intended, for example, to fund a foundation, are likely to be less competitive than completely open, completely free protocols. So as a consequence, it's very difficult to figure out exactly how one ought to maintain these systems, pay for these systems in the long term. So certain proposals such as a patronage type of model where a corporation decides to volunteer its developers may work in the short term, but the challenge is that those developers end up having a huge amount of influence over the evolution and growth of the system. So one can argue that a patronage model will lead to centralization of power into the hands of a few companies that want to modify the protocol in a certain direction. For example, right now, the W3C is having a large debate about bringing DRM into the browser. And we've already seen the EFF resign from the W3C because they feel that larger companies in that effort are influencing this process towards the benefit of large content distributors as opposed to a free and open web. So patronage may not be the best way. ICOs are also an interesting way, and they're like a quick jolt of energy. They provide a lot of capital, and if there's good governance behind that capital and good people behind the capital, certainly can result in the creation of a great product, a great protocol. But the problem is that an ICO isn't an indefinite event or a continuous funding event. Rather, it's a large flood of money in the very beginning to do something. But no matter how large that pile of money is, it's finite and will eventually run out. So the first thing is, can we construct a system that has a treasury? A treasury is where a blockchain is able to print money and put some of that money into a decentralized bank account. And that decentralized bank account is funded through inflation. So the first to pioneer this model was Dash. If you look at Bitcoin, every time a block is produced, it started with 50 coins per every block, and then it decreased by a factor of 2 every 4 years, and now we're down to 12 and a half. All of that goes to the miner. With the Dash model, instead of having all of it go to the miner, some of it actually goes into this decentralized bank account. Then there is a democratic method to vote on funding proposals. So what Bob can do is Bob can submit a ballot to the Treasury. And then the token holders can vote. And if there's a high enough threshold, if there's a high enough amount of voting, Bob's ballot will be approved and the Treasury will open up and pay Bob. So this abstract model is actually incredibly robust because it has a way of being refilled on a continuous basis. It's directly proportional to the overall influence and size of the currency. So as the currency grows, it has more and more resources available, which in turn can be spent to grow the currency. So there's a positive feedback loop. And also it has a democratic process, a democratic participation connected to the system that allows the stakeholders in the system to start having discussions about priorities, namely what ballots ought to be funded. For example, Bob can say, I'm a developer and I want to sustain the system, and submit a ballot. And then Alice can say, I'm a marketer and I want to market the system and create content and videos. And now the token holders get to choose what do they think is a higher priority. further development or marketing. Or perhaps a scientist wants to write a new protocol to improve the existing protocol. Maybe it's a new privacy primitive, for example. Or maybe it's a bit more security with the network stack or a bit more anonymity with the network stack. So instead of going to the National Science Foundation or the European Union and trying to get a traditional research grant, scientists of the future may even be able to use the Treasury model to propose funding for research. Or perhaps you're an application developer, a dApp developer. Maybe you want to bring state channels to Ethereum. Under the current model, one has to do an ICO or something along those lines, issue an unnecessary token that really doesn't provide any utility above and beyond what Ether provides, but do so to raise capital in order to be able to bring this innovation to the system. Instead of having that and segregating value away from the principal token, the token holders now have a mechanism where they actually could provide funding for this dApp. And that's a really exciting proposition. The challenge, however, is that the construction of such a system is a tremendous endeavor and requires quite a bit of deep thought. First off, there has to be a proper and fair voting system. Second, there has to be incentives to vote, incentives to participate above and beyond some notion that this system is going to be a common good. There's a kind of a tragedy of commons notion there. Third, there has to be an easy way to submit ballots, but do so in a way where ballots actually, the reasonable ballots, have higher precedence and priorities over absurd ballots. And do this all in a way that's completely decentralized, and do this all in a way that is somewhat distributed and doesn't require centralized governance. So a treasury is quite hard. Dash had a first example of it, and they've had tremendous success as a project as a consequence. So at IOHK, we are quite interested in this model, and we think this is one of the single most important things about sustainability, because it's leaving something behind embedded within the system itself that allows the system to pay for its own bills. Yet, it is, as I mentioned, quite a bit of research. So we've already started the process. We first started examining the voting system, and we're looking into using a modification of liquid democracy. And then combining that with an incentivized treasury model, that we have developed with a joint partnership with researchers at Lancaster University, as well as some of our personnel that come from Ukraine. And our hope is to develop a reference treasury model that's abstracted from any cryptocurrency. It's just a module that can be plugged into a cryptocurrency such as Ethereum Classic or Cardano. The hope is that the system will have a fairly sophisticated way of balancing the needs and incentives of token holders, as well as the needs of those seeking funding in a reasonable way. Now, this is an inexact science. It's one that requires quite a bit of iteration, and this is why we're trying to construct this system in a modular capacity so that the treasury system can be upgraded independent of the protocol itself if necessary. So this is something we're very excited about. We should be publishing a paper fairly soon, in Q4 of 2017, and our hope is to roll out the first generation of the reference treasury model into the Cardano protocol by about the middle part to the end of 2018. Depending upon how long the research takes. But there's another side to sustainability. It's not just about how do we pay for things. It's also about where should we go? And this is an even bigger meta question. So, cryptocurrencies are living creations. They're not static in that once you've written the code, it's finished, it's done. There's no notion of 2.0. You have to be able to change them as technology changes, use cases change, or new innovations come out that you can benefit from tremendously. And generally, you do this either with soft forks or hard forks. But these are forks nonetheless, meaning that you have to change something. The problem is that in current cryptocurrencies, generation 1 and 2, there is no canonical way of deciding which fork is proper amongst many that have been proposed. And as a consequence, this results in a situation where eventually irreconcilable differences develop and we see the chain break apart, We've seen this with Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. We've seen this with Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, and it will only continue as these systems grow in scale and value. So what we have to do is argue by analogy, are there any social systems that humanity has constructed, which while they may be controversial, have still maintained a degree of stability and updatability? Constitutions are the closest notion that we have. It's the highest law of a country. A constitution doesn't change too much, especially constitutions like the American Constitution, and they're somewhat difficult to change. But when they do change, there's universal consensus post-change that they're going to follow this. We don't see a fracturing of the country into two Americas or two UKs or something like that. We kind of get consensus around it. Why? Because it's a slow, deliberate process, one that people agreed to follow, at least in principle. So if we were to treat protocols as constitutions, one ought to be able to amend the Constitution. One ought to have a process to do so. Because we're engineers and we like reusability, our hope is to use the very same types of mechanics that are used in the Treasury system for approving ballots to actually being able to consider Cardano improvement proposals. So Alice or Bob, the developer, can propose a SIP, and then there's going to be a process which Alice and Bob can follow that allows the network to vote on whether this should be ratified or not. This should be a slow, systematic, deliberate process that takes time and effort with increasingly higher thresholds prior to eventual adoption. Now, the first generation of this technology is more about process and mechanism. It's a meta consideration that lives outside of the network but relies on tools within the network. For example, the ability to do voting by stake weight. Later versions, we're going to explore the idea of converting a Cardano improvement proposal into something that's machine understandable. Similar to a formal specification of a protocol, there is this notion that maybe we can actually specify a cryptocurrency in a way that the cryptocurrency actually understands its own design. If this is possible, then it may be possible to actually verify if a client is following a specification. In other words, when Alice and Bob create their wallets to connect to Cardano, there's this machine understandable canonical notion of how Cardano ought to be configured. And their clients will actually be able to self-accredit and verify if they're actually following the protocol or not. So this is kind of generation 2 and 3. This idea of taking a social process and eventually mechanizing that social process in ways that give us a protocol that lives above the particular software. And we're very hopeful that we can use emerging techniques from programming language theory and formal verification to pursue these ends. So the first micro examples of this are going to start materializing with the formal verification of smart contracts, which is a very important topic for reducing bugs and ensuring that smart contracts are stable and reliable. And this is an area of research that we're pursuing very vigorously at IOHK, and we intend on having several publications come out throughout 2018. Our hope is that those techniques can then be raised a level and we can begin having protocol level descriptions of how Cardano ought to work as a full cryptocurrency stack. And then eventually we can pursue formal verification that clients are connected to a specification. In the short term, however, the Cardano improvement proposal process will be completely written up by Q1 of 2018, and IOHK will begin following that process as it upgrades and iterates the Cardano protocol. And once our treasury voting system is in place, we'll make special accommodations so that every Cardano improvement proposal can eventually go through a process of voting with higher rigor on hard forks and less rigor on soft forks. But nonetheless, there's still some notion of this. We already have an upgrade system built in. If one goes to Cardano docs, there's a specification on cardanodocs.com for how that system works. And later on, that system will be superseded by our new voting system that we intend on rolling out with the Treasury. So this is sustainability in a nutshell. It is our view on how we should responsibly pay for things and our view of where should we go. As protocols start, there's usually a lot of founder vision and a lot of initial philosophy, but as more people come into the ecosystem, as more hopes and dreams get invested into the ecosystem, eventually these ecosystems grow beyond their founders. And so it's incredibly important to have a process for changing the protocol in a very slow, deliberate, methodical way that's as inclusive as possible and as resistant as possible to any particular power broker's ability or machinations. So that's Cardano. Cardano is a third generation protocol. It's built with peer review. It's built with high assurance software standards. It's built in Haskell, my favorite programming language. It's built by a large international team and we're very well funded, and IOHK is committed to it until 2020. And it's built to be sustainable, interoperable, and scalable. Our view of how do we get cryptocurrencies from the first million to the first billion. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to hear from you guys soon.